Cool. Hi, everyone, both in the room with us and remotely. And welcome to this panel event on Rethinking Climate Finance Allocations, hosted by the Center for Global Development and CGIAR, or CGR, not quite sure. Okay, closer. Okay, cool. Hi, it's really loud. Okay. So yeah, as we know, Brazil wants this to be the implementation COP and the adaptation COP. These are two of the words flying around. But adaptation finance is falling drastically short. So the latest adaptation gap report shows that where there's a 12 to 14, or the amount of adaptation finance that we have is 12 to 14 times smaller than what it needs to be, which is around 300 billion. And money is actually declining year on year, and is potentially set to get even worse with overseas aid cuts from countries like the US and the UK. Meanwhile, the demands for climate finance are getting ever bigger, with the LDC group here calling for a trebling of current adaptation finance by 2030. So if there's less money, then it needs to be allocated as well as it possibly can be by both the multilateral funds and bilateral donors. And climate finance agreements are always calling for money to go to the most vulnerable countries, normally defined as least developed countries, or LDCs, and small island and developing states, or SIDS. But who are the most vulnerable? How do we define vulnerability? How do we allocate finance? And how can we make better evidence-based approaches to answer these questions? These are the things we want to look at on this panel. So the panel is going to include some new research being presented from both the Center for Global Development and also from the World Bank, including this new Center for Global Development research paper looking at how vulnerability and resilience is being measured. And we have with us on the panel, Jonathan Benyon, from a senior policy associate at the Center for Global Development at the end. Stefan Hallegate? Yeah? Hallegate? Sorry. Chief Climate Economist at the World Bank. Selamawit Wubit? Cool. Global lead on climate diplomacy at the Global Center for Adaptation. And Jihei? Cool. From the Fund for Responsible Loss and Damage. So, say that again? Sorry. Yeah, not the fund responsible for loss and damage. But the fund responding to loss and damage. Yeah, so we're going to start with a presentation from Jonathan and Stefan, and then we'll give you two a chance to respond. And we'll have a bit of a panel discussion and questions and answers after that. So, Jonathan, would you like to kick it off?
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the light-hearted introduction as well. I think we need it at the end of a long and hot day. But anyway, so I want to present the highlights of this paper. Even closer. Oh, okay. I will be presenting some highlights of this paper and blog, which we published just last week, looking at climate finance allocations and vulnerability. 4 key messages that I want to run through. First of all, different vulnerability indices give wildly different results. Second, LDCs appear to be more vulnerable, perhaps much more vulnerable than SIDS. Thirdly, adaptation finance is highly skewed, with SIDS receiving much more per capita than others. And begs the question, should we be focusing more of our adaptation finance on LDCs? Now, the concepts of vulnerability are themselves complicated, and they have evolved over time. So these are summaries of how the IPCC have presented vulnerability. In its 3rd and 4th assessment reports a couple of decades ago, vulnerability was essentially seen as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. In its later reports, the sort of structure changed slightly, and it looked at, it extracted vulnerability. Exposure was treated separately, combined with hazard to develop an overall sort of risk index. And those different concepts of vulnerability are reflected in a number of different vulnerability indices that different organizations have produced. I've got the formula for them up there. Don't worry, you probably can't even read them. The point of putting them up there is just to show that each of these indices are quite significantly different in the way in which they are structured and composed. What I have tried to do in assessing all these different indices of vulnerability is to extract components that are as comparable as possible at 3 different levels. So there's an overall risk level, if you like. There's a vulnerability level, and then there's a level of exposure, where exposure is focusing primarily on the sort of physical drivers of climate change. And those indices, so the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, the World Risk Index, the Inform Climate Change Index, the Physical Vulnerability to Climate Change Index, which is really just focused on exposure, and the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, which some of you may be familiar with, is broader than just climate and has been used to justify or to try and justify the case for SIDS, which are generally wealthier, having access to concessional resources. What I do is that there are 140 developing countries that are common to all of these indices. And they are very, very poorly correlated with each other. That's the main point. Really, really very poorly. The graph is very short, very hard to read. The left-hand panel just looks at average levels of vulnerability, or overall risk in the top panel, vulnerability in the middle one, exposure at the bottom. That is calculated by normalizing each of the individual indices and making an average of them. Don't worry too much about the left-hand side. It's the right-hand side I want to draw your attention to. And this basically is looking at the maximum value of each index less the minimum value. And basically the yellower the color, the bigger the difference between those, between the indices. So essentially for the overall risk, which is the top right chart, we can see that the variability in those indices is highest in Africa. For vulnerability, actually the variation is relatively moderate and it's fairly uniform all over. For exposure, that's the bottom right, we're in lots of greens and yellows, which basically means that pretty much everywhere there is huge variability in what our exposure indices are telling us as to which countries are most vulnerable. What we do find that of these 140 countries, so the top quartile, so potentially 35 countries, there are only 2 which feature in the top quartile across all of our overall risk indices, Somalia and Yemen. Only 4 for vulnerability, Chad, Niger, Somalia, and Sudan, and only 1 for exposure, Somalia. All LDCs, none of them SIDS. If we look then, essentially this table tries to illustrate the percentage share of LDCs and SIDS, both countries and of their populations, that feature in the top quartile or top half of these indices. I'll just rattle through this quickly. This just shows the panel for the vulnerability index. In the report, there are tables for exposure and overall risk. But the basic point is, on the right-hand side, you have the average index, and the columns in the middle represent each individual index. But the right-hand side column, you can see the top right-hand figure. 58% of all LDCs are in the top quartile, so the top 25% of most vulnerable countries. Only 11% of SIDS are. If you look at it in terms of the numbers of people residing in the top quartile vulnerable countries, 75% of LDC populations, only 22% of SIDS. In fact, and I was staggered by this, looking across all of the indices, most of the time, most SIDS appear in the bottom half of the vulnerability indices, and at the overall risk and at the exposure levels. It was really, it was quite a surprising finding. Moving on to adaptation finance, where does adaptation finance currently go? This is data taken from the OECD progress reports against the $100 billion target. The lines show adaptation per head. First of all, the point to make is that, not on the graph, the shares of adaptation finance going to both LDCs and SIDS is rising. That's encouraging. What the chart shows is that the adaptation per head figures in LDCs, that's the orange line, are about twice the average of all developing countries. That's the blue line. For SIDS, it's about 6 times higher than all developing countries, even though, in fact, SIDS are substantially wealthier on average than is the case of all LDCs, and 8 times richer per capita than LDCs. That said, there is evidence in the adaptation gap report which suggests that the adaptation needs of SIDS are probably somewhat higher, maybe twice as high in per capita terms, partly because they are richer and have more assets to protect, partly because the unit costs of meeting adaptation needs are just higher in SIDS because of the nature of SIDS. The last chart I wanted to put up to try and illustrate a point. The point is that actual levels of adaptation per head are not correlated at all with either our measures of vulnerability or per capita income. So what that shows on the vertical axis of each panel is adaptation per head. It goes from 0 to 700. The scale is truncated. Tuvalu is $2,400 per head is their adaptation finance. The first 3 columns show our risk indices. So risk in the first, vulnerability in the second, exposure in the third, and then per capita income is in the right-hand side. The top row shows all countries with SIDS highlighted in blue dots. The bottom row also shows all countries, but this time LDCs highlighted in blue dots. And the key point to make is that, first of all, massive variation in levels of adaptation per head across all countries. SIDS generally have much higher levels of adaptation per head than all countries. All of the top 10 are SIDS. 2 of them are also LDCs, Kiribati and Tuvalu. But the other point to make is that they're all over the place. There is no correlation at all, really, between adaptation finance and either levels of vulnerability or per capita income. So, just coming back to those 4 key points again, different vulnerability indices give wildly different results, which makes it very difficult to rely on any one index to guide or inform allocation decisions. Secondly, the data suggests, and this might be uncomfortable for some, I was surprised by it, but the data does suggest that LDCs, generally speaking, are the more vulnerable, and SIDS in aggregate appear to be surprisingly less vulnerable than we might have expected. Thirdly, adaptation finance is highly skewed, with SIDS being particularly well, comparatively speaking, supported by adaptation finance. And therefore, there is maybe a case for supporting or focusing more on LDCs when it comes to adaptation finance. But, and there is a really big but, I don't want to undermine or diminish at all the properly frightening existential risks that some SIDS face. What it means perhaps is that different forms of support might be needed. Crucially, loss and damage might be a much more relevant means of support for SIDS, and different allocation rules ought probably to apply when it comes to loss and damage. I'll stop there. I hope there'll be lots of interesting questions, and pass over to Stefan.
Thank you so much. And I'll be standing because I'm afraid of falling from this chair. So thank you very much for the invitation. First, I want to say that this work, I think, is extremely useful. We have all of those indicators. They have been used in a very pragmatic and opportunistic way here and there. I think it's the first time I see a very systematic comparison of all of those indicators. So this is really great. We have our own indicators, which I will describe. I tried to convince Jonathan to put it in the paper, but I only made it to the annex. So it's sort of a disappointment, but I guess we'll take what we can. What I will describe today is the work we have been doing in the context of a much broader revision of the World Bank Group scorecards. So we used to have a scorecard to track the impact of World Bank Group action with a total of 150 indicators, which was, of course, extremely difficult to navigate and to communicate about. So we did a complete revision of this scorecard to reduce the number of indicators to 22 to make our action more targeted and also make it easier for people to just look at what we're doing and our impact. In this work, part of the work was to define what we call vision indicators, which were supposed to mimic our new vision and mission of the World Bank Group, which is to eradicate poverty and boost shared prosperity on a livable planet. And as part of this work, one new indicator was created as a vision indicator, which is counting the number of people at high risk. And I want to contrast this indicator that we decided to build with the indicators that Jonathan described, because we're not starting from countries, we're starting from people. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that vulnerability is a very individual thing, and even in very rich countries, you can have people at high risk. So we felt it was much better to just start from the people, but also because we're trying to mimic a little bit what we did for poverty. So we define the number of people living in extreme poverty. We know the index is imperfect, but it's a fantastic communication tool. Everybody understands it, very easy to explain, very easy to track from a year to the next. And it has revealed, in spite of all of the limits of the extreme poverty indicator, it has revealed a very powerful tool to trigger action. So we're trying to just do the same thing. This is basically the structure of our indicator. So one family is considered at high risk if it is exposed to one of the 4 threats that we identify here. So drought, flood, heat waves, and cyclones, and is at high vulnerability, which is defined as missing on the right-hand side, missing one of the basic tools you need to be able to manage shocks. One thing really important, if you want to define who is at risk of climate change, you can say everyone is at risk of climate change, right? There is no one person on the planet that's completely not at risk. So where you put the threshold is arbitrary. In the same way, when we define extreme poverty, we have a limit that is arbitrary. So that we acknowledge completely. So the number that we set is not what's interesting. What's interesting is how this number changes over time. We want to use it to track progress over time. And we decided, as you suggested in your introduction, to focus on the most vulnerable. So we decided to go for extreme levels of risk. And so for all of the indicators you see here, we put the bar very, very high or very, very low, depending on how you define it. But basically trying to really find the people who are at extremely high levels of risk. The big surprise was, if you do that, you get about 20% of the world population at high risk. So when we divided the limit so high, I was not expecting to find 1.2 billion people in the world at high risk. What you see on the right is circles for every region. Gray is total population. Blue is the people exposed to those threats. And so you see exposure is very well distributed, but you see South Asia and East Asia being much more exposed. The red circle is the among those exposed, the ones at high risk. And you see in Africa, basically everyone exposed is also at high risk. In North America, you have people exposed, but almost no one is at high risk. And that's really the effects of like higher standards of living and wealth. I don't want to get into this, but basically we rely on a lot of data. And one of the issue, which means that I cannot really answer your question, Jonathan, we're missing a lot of data in seeds. And so we have a lot of missing countries in that data set. And that's because in seeds, very often, the latest household survey is 20-year-old. And so one of the things that we also want to say with this indicator is, if we really want to understand vulnerability, we need to collect this data. Without this data, we cannot do it. Second point I wanted to make here is, remember these 7 factors of vulnerability. So not having access to water, not having access to electricity, not having access to a bank account, not being covered by social protections. I was expecting them to be very correlated and correlated with income. Well, they're not. Correlations here, I don't know if you can see, but maybe 0.5. But if you look only at income as a metric for vulnerability, you're missing the point, because it's not that correlated. Very surprising. And it really highlights the value of going into the details of these vulnerability factors. We see that the vulnerability declines with GDP per capita. So richer countries are have a lower fraction of their population at high risk. If you increase GDP per capita by about 10%, you have 1.5 percentage points lower population at high risk. And it means if globally you increase GDP per capita by 10%, you have 100 million people exiting this status of high risk. But you see at the same level of GDP per capita, you have this massive difference. So GDP per capita helps, economic growth helps, but how you grow also matters quite a lot. Finally, my last point is if you look at the last 10 years, we have reduced the share of population at high risk by half. So we see progress. And if you remember, again, my indicators for vulnerability, this is very much because of development. This is better access to finance. This is better access to water, better access to electricity. And so we see the progress in all regions, especially in South Asia, by the way. But of course, this is sort of a race between population growth and development, and we don't see the same progress in all of the countries. Last point I wanted to make is we can use these indicators. We will have a database showing this data with the spatial distribution, because of course you can also use that to target what you're doing. And so in some places you will see you have a problem with heat and maybe a problem with education that is driving your numbers. And in some places it will be something else. So we want to use this to track progress, but also hopefully to target interventions, as again was suggested at the beginning. So I'll stop here, but I think the points I wanted to really stress is vulnerability starting from the households is, I think, a very useful way to avoid the country versus country discussion and to make sure even poor people in rich country are being targeted. And second, the need to work much more on the data, because we cannot do that in all countries because the data is just not there. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. So do you guys want to share some initial responses? Salamwit, start with you.
Okay, well, I want to make a ref. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. I want to make a reference to our work that we were doing. First of all, thank you very much. This is really interesting work. For those of us in the process, we know how sensitive of a topic vulnerability is. But then again, it's good to see the figures and it's good to see what can be done about it. But recently at the Global Center on Adaptation, we published this work on Resilient Economics Index. And one of the things we looked at was on adaptation specifically, where are countries in their policies, how good are they in mobilizing finance, and how ready is their economy to fight climate change. And there was a figure that I found quite interesting, where you had the figures from sub-Saharan Africa. And what we've realized collectively for Africa, 68% of adaptation finance comes in form of loans. And this figure is much, much worse when you look at sub-Saharan Africa. And if we take, for example, Senegal, it's 82%. And for Tanzania, it's 84%. And these are the countries from the continent that are actually good at mobilizing finance, that have managed to access the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and all the other funds that we know of. And imagine if the figure is this bad for these countries that actually are good at mobilizing, how would it look like for those other countries that don't even have accredited entities within these mechanisms? So for me, that was quite alarming. And another thing you mentioned is the figure from Somalia and Yemen. And currently there is this discussion that we're looking at on how conflict and instability impacts your ability for resilience. So those countries, quite often, if you see, they would either not have the capacity to mobilize funding, or they don't have the right policies in place due to instability. So these were like the first two things that I noticed. But when it comes to vulnerability, going forward from these discussions and taking it to the process and perhaps linking that with implementation, one factor that we might have to be mindful about is there was a rationale in having a special circumstance for SIDS and LDCs within the Paris Agreement. But then again, it's not, because we usually say SIDS and LDCs, we tend to think they're the same, and I'm sure from your work, that's what we see, they're not the same. And these two countries do have a special circumstance, these two different nations do have a special circumstance, and perhaps the issue of loss and damage might be much more closer to SIDS, and then the issue of our addressing adaptation is much more closer to LDCs. But another thing that stand out for me is if you look at LDC's countries, you also have countries that have a population of more than 100 million, like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and that makes the challenge even much more difficult. So these were the main things that stood out for me. But
Say that again.
you want me to address the question that you had in plan, or are you want me to come back to that later?
The question I had planned for the no, we'll do that later. Let's get
All right, there you go.
No, thank you very much. And I'll just introduce myself. I'm Ji-Hae Kim from the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. Thankfully, we're not responsible for loss and damage. And just to start to say, we are the new kid on the block. We are the fourth multilateral climate fund to be established under the UNFCCC. Many, many thanks to the countries and communities and civil society, and actually all of us in the community that fought for many, many years for this fund to exist. I will say on this topic, we came into, we were invited into the session, and it really intrigued me, first of all, because the issue of vulnerability and exposure is one that I feel is hotly contested in any circles that we go into. And I really appreciate the research that you came up with, Jonathan and Stefan, because it's very intriguing for us when we look at it in the perspective of responding to loss and damage. How would those indicators and how would those results actually feed into what this fund may allocate or not allocate to countries? Now, what I will start off by saying is, first of all, and before I go into the, to do my job and explain to you what the fund is all about and what the BIM is all about. So before I get into that, I do have a question to the panel, and I'm sorry if it's just coming kind of out of the blue, but from my experience, I do see that when we say countries are more vulnerable or less vulnerable or more exposed, I do wonder if we take into account the differences in countries. And you see at community level or sub-regional level or sub-district level, the vulnerabilities and exposures are actually quite specific to those specific locations, or it could be for specific communities. And I say this just in the example of Indonesia, which is considered a middle-income country, but you have very remote islands in Indonesia that have very different access to resources, to jobs, to ability to recover. While Indonesia may be classified as a middle-income country, therefore not eligible for full grants, let's say, just as an example. So I do wonder how we differentiate between when we classify countries versus the differences between communities and regions and locations within countries, I think is another thing that just kind of popped in my mind. Now to get to the business. So FRLD, many thanks to all your support, many thanks to our board, and we have a board member, our old board member sitting in the audience. We were able to launch the first call for proposals a few days ago on Monday for the startup phase of the fund. And this is really just the initial phase that we are looking into testing the initial modalities. It's by no means perfect. And I keep telling my colleagues, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist myself, and so sometimes I have a bit of discomfort when I look at modalities that might not be fully completed. But when you think about the topic of loss and damage and the complexities around where do we fit in adaptation, where do we fit in disaster risk, where do we fit in humanitarian, or do we fit at all? Maybe the point is not to have a perfect model where we have defined that structure. And this BIM to me is a phase where we get to test the demand. We get to test what countries say are their needs, what they have experienced in their vulnerable communities or vulnerable contexts. And there we get to receive a lot of information and data from the requests that receive. So you see, and everything is published on our website. I'm not going to go through, I only was given 3 to 4 minutes. So everything is published, our templates are online, our funding criteria, funding cycle, our access modalities are all online. But one thing that we do intention seeing is we've provided a broad framework for countries to provide requests. And the intention of being broad is so countries can show us to the fund how they define loss and damage, how they define their needs. What does responding mean in their context? What does vulnerability mean in their context? So we really see this to be a bottom-up exercise. And one of the principles of the BIM, one of the core principles of the fund actually is to promote country-led, country-owned, and bottom-up approaches to programming. So I'll say that here, and I'm very intrigued by the research that was just shared, and I think it would be a very valuable partnership, I believe, with FRLD to look at these types of research that are coming out and to assess further for the long-term operational model of this fund. Our governing instrument does mandate us to look at scale of impact, to look at vulnerability, to look at vulnerable communities. And these are elements that we as a secretariat, that's our homework to figure out for the long term. How do we look at it? What is the best way to do it? So we'd love to engage with you. We'd love to engage with the audience and to share ideas. But just to say for now, the BIM in our startup phase, we have an allocation of 50% of our 250 million that's allocated to SIDS and LDCs. And you can argue it's because they are considered particularly vulnerable compared to other groups. But in the long term, we do have more homework to think about, regardless of whether you are grouped in a specific category. How can we define vulnerability and scale of impact? How can we define the need based on costs of recovery and reconstruction, which is a whole nother conversation. So just to say, we're here, we're working through the weeds. We have a model that we're testing in the BIM. It's not going to be perfect, but maybe that's the point. And we hope to engage with you further to look deeper into these topics as we build for the long term. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jihye. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, what you made about Indonesia, because it also reflects how in your graph, there were like the biggest number of people was in South Asia. It's kind of like you can categorize these countries as poorer or more vulnerable than others, but actually the most poor people are actually in middle income countries, just because they have bigger populations. But returning to you, Jonathan, yeah, I'm wondering if you have any responses to what we just heard, and also I think I guess beyond the kind of theory of these ratings being different, like can you think of a kind of like practical way forward, or what do you think how can we improve definitions of vulnerability?
No, thanks, Nick, and thanks to the three on my left as well. I guess my main reaction to what has been said is that Stefan, I've always loved your work, and the rigor that goes into it is brilliant. I absolutely get the point that having a simple metric analogous to the poverty headcount measure is really, really useful. I am struck, however, that it doesn't really take into account the severity of households' vulnerability to some of the different factors that you put up there, or indeed how many of them they are vulnerable to. That starts getting more complicated, and there's a trade-off, isn't there, between simplicity and depth, if you like. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I guess start simple and develop it later if need be. I also take the point about it's households that matter, and I like the metric from that point of view. I can see it's a brilliant metric for monitoring progress over time. I'm struggling to see I'm struggling to conclude that it is as good a metric for helping to inform allocation decisions, partly for the reason that you said, that you're missing data for so many countries. And if you have a lot of countries which don't have the data, then you can't, it makes it that much more difficult to allocate resources. But no, it's fabulous stuff. Salam, you were talking about the point that SIDS and LDCs are often grouped together, but actually they are really very, very different, is one I would utterly agree with. What I would love to ask you back is that within GCA and how you're thinking about allocating adaptation finance, how do you actually go about that, and whether you recognize that there are differences between SIDS and LDCs in those allocation decisions. Jihye, I thought your point about there being difference within countries is really, really relevant. I mean, it's so striking that India and China are counted as one unit in all of these vulnerability indices, and yet there are massive differences within those countries which are just not handled by these vulnerability indices. I don't have a good answer to that. One thing that did strike me was that if your current rules or current guidelines are that 50% of FRLD funds should go to SIDS and LDCs, I'm surprised at how little that is, actually. I would have anticipated it being pretty close to 100%. But anyway, maybe you'll get there in the end. In terms of how things can be improved going forward, I mean, it is just so striking how disparate these different indicators or indices of vulnerability are. It just makes it I can remember having worked in government before, being asked the question, so Jonathan, which countries are most vulnerable to climate change? And you go, it's complicated, it's difficult. It is complicated and it's difficult, but that question will keep on being asked and we need better answers to it. It does strike me. What was really interesting was that when you look at some of these broad indices, and their purposes are slightly different. I mentioned that they are structured differently, but we've done some other research which suggests that even individual indicators which appear to be common to the indices, they can come up with quite different rankings when you look across the indicators. So it does strike me that there is, I'm an analyst, I'm a researcher, I would say this, more technical work is needed to try and understand this, but it really is. I would love to see a process in which the different, maybe it is happening already and I'm just not familiar enough with it, but in which the different exercises that develop these indices are just brought together to try and bring out the best of all of them, or at least to try and understand better why they differ and for what purposes different indices might be used for. That keeps it at a very technical level. I think we've concluded already that allocations and the definition of who is particularly vulnerable is inherently political. And in our paper, we make the suggestion that, well, maybe this is a process that needs to be brought into the political fold, maybe through the UNFCCC. I hesitate to say that. We know how complicated that is. But divorcing the technicalities from assessment to vulnerability and allocation to finance from the political realities, I just don't think is helpful. Somehow we need to bring those two processes together. Let me stop there and we can come back later.
Yeah. Anyone have any initial responses to that? Yeah, go for it.
Just to add one thing, what you last said about allocation and then having this discussion further, just make sure you don't say it further back in the blue zone, because currently we're having a discussion on 9.5 and how that can be addressed. And within the Paris Agreement, as part of 9.2, we have a phrase that goes like other countries that are also in a position to provide funding. But it's been equally, as much as it's difficult to discuss vulnerability, it's also equally difficult to discuss the source and where it needs to come from. But I do get the sense that it's important to break this down further so that it responds to the communities that need to benefit from this.
Cool. Thank you very much. Stefan, have you got anything you'd like to share? Or beyond that, I'm curious, you've shown us your kind of new analysis of how you can assess vulnerability, but when the World Bank is making its kind of practical decisions, how are you sort of beginning to integrate new thinking, or how are you kind of keeping abreast of all this research?
Yeah, and I think it also answers your point about simplicity versus depth, right? It's not like we have only one tool to do the allocation, right? To decide what to do in every country, the main tool we have are the country climate and development reports, which are like full reports done in every country by a team of maybe 50 experts in the different sectors. And the amount of work that you do, the amount of interaction with governments, with the private sector, with think tanks and universities, and it's not something you can do with the global indicators, just combining sub indicators that you find online, right? So when we want to really define priorities, this is a very involved piece of work with specific analytics dedicated to that. It's not just the indicator. The indicator I showed you is supposed to help us track progress. And it's a very different goal. So I think we have also to make sure we don't assume that there is one way of doing this that will answer the question of tracking progress over time, allocating resources, defining priorities. We can use different tools that are better suited for these different roles. One illustration of that is to your point on seeds. So we're working on a small state strategy at the moment. And if you look at risk, what's striking is small states are not more at risk than the others. What's really different is a small island can lose 100% of its GDP in one event. It cannot happen even in super risky countries like Japan or the Philippines, just because of the size. And so it's not so much about higher risk. It's what they need is very different. In particular, they cannot keep the risk domestically. They have to share the risk internationally. And so all of the discussions about risk sharing, contingent finance, emergency management with international support is particularly important for them, even if the risk level is low. Like in a place like Fiji, the risk level on average is not that high. but when they're affected, the shock is enormous. And so there is no way you can have one indicator showing you this specific vulnerability to very big events and the average level of risk. You need two things. Another point I wanted to make is, because I get your point on allocation, but take a country like the Philippines with very high level of risks and very high levels of poverty in some places. You might define an allocation rule that is based on the existence of this very at-risk and poor population. But then the question is, then this allocation of resources, does it has to be invested for this population? Or can it go to Manila, where you have much higher incomes and lower risks? So I think even when we say allocation, we have to discuss exactly what we mean, right? Is it an allocation for the World Bank envelope, or is it an allocation for doing disaster risk management? Because then I would do different things. Last point maybe on adaptation finance, because you started by mentioning the gap, and you mentioned this discussion between grants and loans. I think it's not necessarily super useful to aggregate all of the needs, because we're merging things which are so different. We have one need, which is every time there is an investment, we need to build things in a resilient way. Most of the time, it increases the cost by maybe 5%, and most of the time, it saves money over the lifetime of the assets. So using a loan to do that is not necessarily a problem. I mean, if you think of the roads, if you pay 5% more to build the roads, the savings that you'll have in the maintenance of the roads, in your annual budget of road maintenance, you can have the resources to pay back the loan. We have other needs for adaptation, which are dedicated projects like flood management infrastructure, healthcare, the most vulnerable communities that need help, land restoration. Those things generate public goods. There is no easy flow of revenues from them because they are public goods. And here, a loan is very complicated because you need to find a financial flow of revenues to pay back the loan. But if you look at the numbers, at least half of the needs are things that should create a flow of revenues that allows you to pay back the loan. And so we can have much more impact if we use loans for these things, for which loans are the right tool. My fear is because of all of these numbers being aggregated, it makes everything look impossible, right? You have these huge numbers. If you want to meet them with grants, it's just like, it's just not going to work, right? So we have to take those numbers, break them into pieces. For each of the piece, find the right financial system to just meet the need. And when you do that, you realize things are much more doable. And if they look more doable, maybe they're most likely that we find solutions and we can make progress. And I find it a bit discouraging when we look at the global numbers and the big gap, because it looks so big, it looks we cannot do anything. In fact, there are a lot of things we can do, a lot of things that are generating a flow of revenues that can pay back for this.
Nice. That's good to hear. Cool. Yeah, Salamo. Yeah, I'm curious. What's your kind of perspective on improving allocations, given what we hear and also from your own experience?
Thank you. I think one of the things that we've been looking at, especially when it comes to improving allocations, is that for the past 2 years, for example, prior to the Baku decision, we've been trying to look at the quality and the quantity of finance. I see where you're coming from on having loans for public goods and all of that, and I understand those are not avoidable, and it's also good to have them. But then again, within that, we still can make flexibility, and within that, we can also create a space for more sources to come in. For example, if we were to work on enabling environments, sometimes adaptation is not quite appealing for private sector, so there could be a space where we can mobilize. But another thing that we noticed, especially looking at accreditation processes and access to finance, so many SIDS or African countries do not have that access as well. So it might sound a bare minimum, but there is a need for capacity building to making sure that these countries can access the existing finances. But this is when it comes to existing finance. And it's very clear compared to the needs we have and compared to all the finance flow, it's never gonna match, it's never gonna be enough. So we still have to get creative, we still have to look for other sources. But we also equally at the same time have to look at the efficiency of the processes we've set in place. It's very good that we have the new baby of the funds with us. So perhaps I think you can use this as a learning experience from what countries have done in the past. How easy is this going to be for countries? Or is it going to be burdensome? It sounds like there are countries that might not be able to access the fund just because they couldn't draft the concept note in a way it can easily be approved. So for those of us working in the climate space, we still have to support these initiatives. I hear, we constantly hear capacity building, and it sounds like we're just throwing it out there, but it's actually needed. But for the new fund, I'm assuming you already have a base on what to improve, and perhaps these are the things that we need to take into account and learn from each other. Thank you.
Yeah, would you like to respond to that? And I'm also, I think it's worth raising when we talk about loss and damage, obviously, like the elephant in the room, which is that there's so little finance available. So yeah, but both offer a response to that, and also, you know, why are conversations like this important, even though that's obviously the main priority, just getting more money?
Wow. No, I think there's a lot to reflect in just the discussion that we had. And just to, you know, answer your question, we do have a massive benefit in being the new kid in town, because that means there's been other kids before us who have gone on their own journey to define how to address the question of who might need more than others and therefore be prioritized in allocations made by specific climate funds or specific boards who who approve projects. And I think there's a lot to learn there, even just looking around at our partners and their experiences, the GEF GCF Adaptation Fund being one, but also even within the World Bank, you know, sphere of fifths of financial intermediary funds who also are dealing with the same questions and issues. So we do have a massive benefit. What I will say is, in terms of access and allocation, the fund is set up in a way, and I think FRLD is a bit different in that it touches upon a concept of loss and damage, which is one that is a bit different, I would say, from adaptation and mitigation. And if we look at it in the context of why did loss and damage even exist in the first place, then perhaps the question is not about grants, loans, guarantees, equity, but that question of how did it start? What did it come from, and why did it happen? So I don't have an answer to that particular question. It could be a political one, but it could be a technical one as well. But I will say is that the FRLD therefore has to look at this problem in a different way because of it being a fund that is about loss and damage, and it's not a fund about mitigating or adapting to climate impacts, which I feel has different context. So I'll say that. Now, the other is when we talk about, you know, communities and their needs and their vulnerabilities, I do think that's an important question, and maybe perhaps the next question the fund has to ask itself is, how do we support at the community level? And something that in the BIM, in our first phase, we call it the Barbados implementation modalities, for those that aren't familiar. But in the first phase, we weren't able to produce a concrete modality for that. But it is an intention of the board to ask this question for the long-term modality, to say, how do we provide small grants? And I don't like the word small grants because small is a subjective word. But basically to say, how do we give access directly to communities, understanding that sometimes flows of finance from governments do not always flow all the way down to the actual community recipients or those that are actually on the front lines. So this is a question I don't have an answer for, and I probably, you know, it's up to our board to come up with a decision on that. But it is a question that we are asking ourselves, and I do believe the data, the evidence, and the research being done will be helpful in us finding perhaps ways that we could do this in a way that is fair and it's equitable, but it's also aligned with the topic of loss and damage, which I would like to say is it should be treated quite differently from mitigation adaptation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dihei. Like to open it up to the room if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask any of the panelists on any of these points. Yes? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm a researcher at ODI Global. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on the presentation. Oh, and I should let you know as well that I'm an advisor to AOSIS, so I'm not kind of I've got some some comments on the analysis of SIDS, and then a question. So I don't love indices anyway, and let me just kind of put that out there. That I don't, there's always going to be a problem with indicator selection and methodology. I think it makes a little bit more sense at the individual household level. And I think maybe somebody made the point that, intensity or severity of poverty and intensity of hazard and all of that kind of thing is really important. And so I was just wondering, Stefan, why that wasn't included in the analysis, why you decided not to. Maybe it's just a simplicity thing. But, indices missing lots of data is like more than a small problem. And I wonder why we continue to have kind of conversations about like creating new indices and reanalyzing data that already exists, and not kind of maybe spend a bit more time or the same sort of money and effort in actually filling some of the data gaps. And that's like maybe a question for the bank as well. The MVI, which I think is a bit different in the sense that it measures structural vulnerability. So the idea is that it's something that is not subject to kind of policy change. And I think that's important because it means that there's, it gives it a different meaning. Like it's structural issues that you can't easily change with policy. So if some countries come out as being structurally more vulnerable, then they're probably going to be need for more external assistance or international finance, which you were talking about. If they are maybe like have other vulnerabilities but don't have those structural vulnerabilities, so they're vulnerabilities you can do something about, then maybe the government should be doing something about them, without like pointing any fingers. But that's a personal view. So I think it is different, and it also has data for all countries. So whilst I'm not a fan of the MVI, it does have its advantages in the sense that the data covers all countries. None of the other indices that you referred to have complete data sets for any of the SIDS, I don't think. They have very, very limited data. So they have some indicators, data for some indicators and not others. And then I just wanted to make a point about the adaptation finance, because it's allocations, because it's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say that, of course, it's somewhat obvious that small countries with small populations will have higher sort of allocations per capita because the denominator is so small, right? That's kind of inevitable. But I think you made the point that the costs of adaptation are higher in some SIDS and in LDCs as well, and certainly in kind of remote places and communities, and the costs of infrastructure in particular are extraordinarily high. So I'm just wondering whether that comparison makes any sense at all, like adaptation finance per capita. Does it make, I mean, in what sense does that make? And I mean, you could say the same thing about GDP per capita, or loads of other per capita measures of anything, right? That's, I'm not sure that it's actually that helpful personally. But yeah, I think my overall point is that I think that we will always struggle to use these kind of indices, vulnerability indices, in a meaningful way to help with allocation of finance. And maybe we shouldn't be looking at sort of pitting groups of vulnerable countries against each other, because when we're talking about adaptation finance from GCF, or it's such small amounts of money, it's tiny amounts of money really that SIDS and LDCs are getting and will ever get from these funds. So I'm not sure that that's the point I would want to be emphasizing. But interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to let this gentleman ask a question or contribute, and then we can go back to the panel.
Right. Thanks, everybody. It's a really good panel, really stimulating. A couple of things. Firstly, Jonathan, I think it is really good to be just testing our understanding of indices, how they're correlated and what it means, right? Because they all develop over time and they develop a normative way of understanding them, engaging with them. For what it's worth, for FCDO recently, we took ND gain as our jumping off point, right? As we started to think about what would be useful. But I agree with you, Emily, you have to be very careful about them. But the point I really wanted to make, though, was underneath all of this is the question that we're grappling with in FRLD, and anyone with a pot of money has to grapple with at any level, which is, what is the most effective way that we can spend this money, right? And that's the question that we're trying to work with on FRLD. So yes, there are limited resources, right? Fine. But if you know you have finite resources, what you're looking for are ways in which you can say, as stewards of these resources, we are spending in the way that has the greatest impact, produces the greatest good, right? So I would like the panel to tell Jihai and I what to do about that, and Marga, who's here, for the FRLD, because that's a really important question and a really hard one. But I also think, understanding that these are different means to different ends. So Stefan, your thing is about measuring progress, which is going to be really important in building confidence, right? That's a very different thing about how you construct an allocative system. And Jonathan, just for the record, to say that the 50% is a minimum allocation floor for the FRLD. It is not a ceiling, and there are many members of the board that would expect to see that, because of all the things we have said here today, to be much higher as we do that learning within the BIM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. People like to offer a response. Jonathan, perhaps you can start.
Thanks a lot for those two comments and questions. A few points. Yes, Emily, totally get that the MVI is rather different from the other indices, and I think we've all agreed that these indices they're problematic, they're difficult, but we still have to answer the question somehow, given limited resources. How do we allocate them best? Unless we grapple with this question of how do we measure what it is that would influence those decisions, then we're always going to struggle. On your point about SIDS, they're small countries. Inevitably, they're going to have higher levels of support. We've looked at that. It's true for ODA per head. ODA flows to SIDS are higher than for developing countries overall. However, when we looked at this, the ratio of SIDS adaptation per head to all developing countries ODA per head was higher than, the ratio of SIDS adaptation to head to all developing countries adaptation to head was higher than SIDS ODA per head relative to all developing countries ODA per head. In other words, there does seem to be still a skew in favor of SIDS, which I totally get why that happens. But the key conclusion that, for all their flaws, but looking across a whole range of indicators, that didn't seem to be well warranted, frankly, based on it's an uncomfortable truth. But that was the inescapable conclusion that I reached. I would love to see a world in which we had 10 times as much money that we could spend, and then some of these choices wouldn't be quite so hard. It's not about pitting countries against each other. It's just trying to make best use of the limited resources that we have, while at the same time pitching as hard as we can for more, because that is undoubtedly needed.
Thank you. So I'll try to also cover a few of the questions. First, you discussed the data gaps, and here, maybe without being too politically correct, the countries we don't cover in our indicator, it is because the data doesn't exist. So I mean, I'm happy that it's covered by other indicators, but I don't know what it's based upon. The data just is not there. And so I think it has also to ring bells, right? How do you do a vulnerability index when in a country, your latest household survey is 25-year-old? 25-year-old. So you don't know the population. You don't know how many people you have. You don't know if they have access to energy. You don't know anything. So I would be also very careful that it's a bit magical when you have those indices arriving with 185 countries. Just some of the data is reconstructed, and I think we have to be very careful with that. I'm completely with you on the depth of vulnerability and risk. One can make the case that this is the same for poverty, right? Our new extreme poverty line is at $3 per day. Some people have 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. It's very different from having $3 per day. So the depth of poverty is also something important. I think here we have the trade-off between having an index that's super complicated, non-linear, and so on, and nobody really understands what it means, versus using this simplification. We have other tools. We have an index, for instance, based on this report Unbreakable that we did a few years ago. It calculates the actual quantification of the risk level, also based on household surveys. It's more precise, but we see the difference. It's very hard to communicate about it, and I'm not sure we can have the same mobilization based on it. On the seeds specificity and the question of per capita, one thing that we haven't discussed is allocation is one thing, but to me, the big obstacle in seeds is fragmentation. Is the fact that a country with just a few people to manage those funds in the government have to manage 12 different funds, and that it really complicates things. So I think there is also a question of modality of access that needs to be think about. And you mentioned getting the money directly to the people. I think one connection that really climate finance needs to do more of is the link with financial inclusion. There's a whole community out there creating financial instruments that works for poor people. They have a lot of expertise. They are building this plumbing to really bring resources to the people who need it. And I don't think the connection is strong enough. And last point, on your question, I think on the allocation, I mean, I don't know if you know how IDA allocates resources, but it's based on needs, which is the poverty, I mean, the GDP per capita, and a definition of capacity to absorb the resources, which is meant to create an incentive also. And I think this is something that we really should be thinking about, is those allocation and indices needs to create the right incentives for countries and for staff in organizations like mine to try to do what is the best use of the resources. And it's not only what you do with the money, it's also the incentive you create by saying, if you're implementing in the right way and we have impact and we see the results, more will be coming, and to create this pump of like a positive interaction. So it's not only a static allocation rule, it's also trying to look at the dynamics of how we get those countries out of those vulnerability traps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, final couple of comments because we're just about out of time.
Just to say, because we have the loss and damage fund here, it's because you have room for progress. But I think one thing we have to look into our process is making sure that it's efficient. And one of the things that we have to look at is the policies we design should not be cumbersome. I'm sure after a few disbursements, countries would come to you and they would say, this is so complicated. So we have to make sure the policies should facilitate access and not hinder it, and perhaps working across mechanisms to make sure that there is a much better response. But there is one thing I want to add, which is the topic of vulnerability is sensitive and it's not comfortable as well. But we need to have this discomforting conversation so that the finances that's out there is efficient and accessible. So it's all about enhancing the process, and to that effect, I think these conversations are very much relevant. Thank you.
No, thank you, and I fully agree. I think the uncomfortable conversations are probably the ones that we should be having, and I think this is exactly why the session I feel is meaningful in and of itself. What I will say, and just to respond to that, is yes, again, just to reiterate, we do have a very big benefit of learning from what others have done, and we have seen and heard from these countries who have already experienced other climate funds, other sources of funds, where they have run through many obstacles in actually accessing the finance, much less implementing it. So it is a vision of FRLD as well as our board, but also the Secretariat, to make sure we are learning from what has worked and has not worked in the other climate funds. It is my intention as head of programming to make sure everything we do is simplified and streamlined, not for us always, but more for the countries that we are all hoping to serve. And I forgot to respond to your other question on capacity constraints in countries. And I think this is something, we take quite seriously, is there should not be a template so complex to fill in that countries themselves cannot fill it out. And that is an intention of the template that we have produced online. We'd love to hear feedback on it. Again, we, as you say, we have room to grow. We are maturing every day. So I won't call it the most simplified template on this planet, but we are hoping to get there. We are hoping to improve consistently. The other point is on, yes, and thank you, Gerard, for reminding me it is a minimum allocation. And there is a big, big intention of our board to make sure that this does reach those two groups in a way that's meaningful. What I will also say is our board has also provided us guidance on making sure there's geographical balance in the projects that are approved. So making sure beyond that allocation, making sure no single country or single region is getting a lot more funding than another region or another country. And the way that we do that, well, maybe in a few months we'll have an answer to that, but that's also guidance that our board has given us as well. On the last on, the size of funding compared to the size of need, I think is a really important question. And I go back to what was said by Gerard as well, is, regardless of the number, I think the number will never be enough. I don't really believe, even if this fund was 10 times, 20 times more bigger, I'm actually not sure we would even reach the amount of funding that we need. So with what we have and with what we have right now, how can we prove the concept? How can we say with 5 to 20 million per request of FRLD grant, how has that leveraged other resources? How has that produced a bigger impact than what could have been imagined before? And that's homework that I would actually have our countries to brainstorm with us, to say, countries, where do you feel this might work? In the landscape of adaptation, mitigation, humanitarian disaster, all these sources of finance, how do you see FRLD grant being a catalyst and leverage is what I would want to see our countries to tell us in their funding requests. So just to say, I do think our startup phase, I'm very excited to see what comes, because it will facilitate our understanding of the space as what is told to us by countries. And it will also help to convince the international community of why we need more funding in this fund. So I hope that it answers the multiple different questions, and we'd love to engage further outside of this panel as well. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jihye. And thank you very much to our panelists for a very interesting discussion.